This is the second part, this time covering the frames released between Limbo and Nidus. To quickly summarize the premise of these videos, I'm covering every frame's ability tips, the tips found under the ability tab, fact-checking them, giving them a score, and pointing out other things that I also think could work as tips. The ranking system works as a scale from +3 to -3, with 0 being just kind of pointless, +1, 2, and 3 being true and gradually more useful, and -1, 2, and 3 being false and gradually more misleading. A score of +3 generally means that I also think the information in the tip is so important or core to how an ability works that it really should be added to the base ability description. With the summary out of the way, I have a couple clarifications that I also want to go over. If you just want to get to the actual tips, there should be a timestamp on screen. Okay, so ability descriptions and tips mainly exist to explain things, mechanics, interactions, that kind of stuff. But they also exist to generate interest in a frame. The very first quest in the entire game, Awakening, makes you pick a starter frame based almost exclusively on ability descriptions. And new players also have access to the full list of frames, and are able to read their ability descriptions to get a feel for how they play and determine whether they're interested in that character or not. This is why I think ability descriptions should explain what they do as well and in depth as possible. Things that could get new players excited about certain frames are just completely missing, like Max Magnetize drawing in your own projectiles, or Excalibur being able to modify the stats on his Exalted Blade. And while yes, these things are in the ability tips, and that's nice, the vast majority of players will never read these ability tips, or even know they exist. As for what tips should be then, I think they exist on a scale from how unintuitive something is and how useful it is. If something is useful, but also very obvious, like the fact that Volts 4 scales with duration, that's not a great tip. If something is very obscure, but also basically useless, like casting Petrify on Atlas's Tectonics walls to empower it, that's also not really something the player needs to know. However, if something is incredibly important, and the player likely won't figure it out on their own, it shouldn't be hidden in the ability tips, where most players won't ever find them, which is where I would give something a +3. Volt's Electric Shield, doubling the critical damage of any projectile fired through it, is a great example of a +3. Sometimes something will already be mentioned in the ability stats, which are the numbers underneath the description that explain like damage, duration, and all that stuff, but I'll still argue that it should be added to the ability description as well. This is because it's not always clear what the ability stats are referring to. For example, the stats for Baruch's 4, Serene Storm, mention a 25% damage reduction, and since the description doesn't mention that it makes Baruch take less damage, it's entirely possible that someone would read this and assume that it means that it reduces Baruch's own damage. However, that becomes less of a problem as you grow more familiar with the game and learn that damage reduction always refers to taking less damage. And then there is Chroma's 4, which uses the term armor reduction, which is the same term that any ability that reduces enemy armor also uses, despite the fact that Chroma's 4 reduces his own armor. So, basically, if we can't have consistency, then we need clarity. We need clear, in-depth explanation of what things mean on a case-to-case basis. I also know that asking for a ton of ability tips and descriptions to be updated is not super realistic, since it's not as simple as just changing some text. Warframe is currently available in 15 different languages, so any text changes need localization to be shipped. I am also aware that some of the wrong tips are due to the tips not being updated after an ability was reworked. I decided pretty early on when making this series to not focus too much on this, as spending a couple extra days scrolling through patch notes and changelogs just seemed kinda miserable. There is still a limit to what I'm willing to put myself through. Still, if there is any context that I'm missing, please let me know. Lastly, I just want to remind anyone watching that the plan is still to do a big combined video with corrections and additions once I've finished all frames. So if there's anything you think I should add, please let me know. Okay, now I should get into the actual tips. Limbo. The Rift provides cover from hazards like Grineer arc traps and laser barriers, +1. This is useful but kinda niche. It would be a lot more useful if it mentioned that it allows Limbo to slip through spy mission laser barriers without triggering alarms. Allies can roll to leave the rift when banished, +3. It would be really nice if this was explained somewhere else, since Limbo isn't really the one that needs to know this, it's his allies. It could at least be explained in Limbo's passive or Banish's description, so more Limbo players know about this and can then tell their allies about it. Banish can be used to protect vulnerable allies, including friendly NPCs. +2. Not the main use case, but still a really cool way to use Banish and give Limbo some cool new things to be good at. Limbo must be on the same plane as its target to push them out of their current rift plane using Banish, +1. This is already explained in the ability description for Banish, though Limbo is pretty confusing and this is very important using Banish, so I think it's still fair to have a tip for it. Stasis' duration is half as long as Cataclysm. Recast Stasis frequently to ensure any enemies caught by Cataclysm remain frozen and vulnerable, +1. This is solid information that you should always keep in mind while playing Limbo, but it's not too hard to figure out by just looking at the durations for Stasis and Cataclysm. Stasis freezes enemies who enter the rift. Combine it with Cataclysm to protect defense objectives, +1. This is also pretty obvious, but it gives a concrete use case with protecting a defense objective. Cast Stasis before Banish or Cataclysm to instantly freeze enemies in place, +2. This is really solid advice that makes Limbo flow a lot better, as it might not be immediately obvious that you can cast Stasis without any enemies to affect. Cast Cataclysm on defense objectives to keep them safe inside the rift, 0. This just feels like a repeat of tip 6. Cataclysm deals more damage to enemies within it when detonated at its minimum size, 0. This is true, but not really worth playing around. If you want to do damage with Cataclysm, you're often just better off casting and instantly ending it, as waiting for it to shrink just takes too long. Detonating Cataclysm by recasting does less damage to the same target for every subsequent use, +1. This is technically useful to know, but Limbo isn't particularly strong, and this is just another reason why. Basically, Cataclysm deals damage based on enemies' current health, so dealing damage to them leaves them with less current health and then less damage. Damaging status effects like Slash, Gas, or Toxin will continue dealing damage while enemies are affected by stasis, 0. There is no reason to assume that it wouldn't work this way. From what I understand, this is just a leftover from how stasis used to work years ago, so this should just be removed. Allies inside the rift can still damage enemies using their Warframe abilities, +3. It would be really nice if this was explained to Limbo's allies instead of being hidden in his tips. It's probably also worth noting that since exalted weapons count as ability damage, they can also damage enemies through the rift. Cast Rift Surge before Cataclysm expires in order to keep all enemies in the rift between casts, +2. Also, solid information that informs how you can play Limbo and how his abilities fit together with a practical example. Rift Surge is, at least in my opinion, the hardest of Limbo's abilities to figure out how you're supposed to use, so this is a great way to introduce players to how it works. Extra. Limbo can damage and destroy most traps, resource containers, and other objects through the rift. Limbo cannot interact with things like consoles, pick up data masses, or loot while in the rift, unless inside the Cataclysm. However, allies can still be revived through the rift. Hold cast Banish to forcefully eject every unit from the rift except yourself, though this should probably be in the base ability description. When enemies affected by Rift Surge leave the rift, they will banish themselves and every enemy near them. Combine this with Banish's hold cast to get more enemies into the rift. Cataclysm's explosion damage scales with the amount of enemies caught inside it, and 10% of their current health and shields when it ends. Banish and Rift Surge knocks enemies down, leaving them open to ground finishers. However, if they enter the rift while stasis is active, they are stunned and not knocked down. Activate stasis after knocking them down to keep them stunned and open to finishers. The rift's passive and on-kill energy restore also applies to allies in the rift or Cataclysm. Stasis also stops all enemy projectiles in the rift, preventing overguarded enemies like Eximus units from attacking Limbo with ranged weapons when they are in the rift. Just like Warframe abilities, most special enemy attacks, like those from Eximus units, also ignore the rift and can affect Limbo through it. Stasis applies to enemies in the rift, no matter how far away from Limbo they are. Being in the rift allows you to hit enemies inside the Cataclysm while outside of it. The added Cataclysm duration gained from the Cataclysm Continuum augment does not restore the size Cataclysm loses over time. Mesa. Cast Ballistic Battery before entering Peacemaker to store Mesa's regulator damage and recast to release it all in a single shot, +1. This is a great way to get value out of Ballistic Battery. The problem is just that Ballistic Battery's damage buff is very single target focused, which often isn't very useful. Outside of that, this technically isn't that hard to figure out on your own. One really cool thing that isn't mentioned here is that Ballistic Battery is the only other ability that Mesa can cast while in Peacemaker, letting her use it to shield gate. Shooting Gallery not only jams guns from nearby enemies, but also temporarily stuns melee units, +3. I don't really get why this can't just be part of the base ability description. Shooting Gallery's crowd control sounds pretty bad if you don't know that it also applies to melee enemies. I know that it's less thematic, but it would make a lot more sense if the description just said that it stuns enemies. In addition to reducing the damage from enemy fire, Shatter Shield also reflects status effects, -3. I honestly thought that this gave status immunity for a second, so I think this tip just ends up being kind of misleading. I think it's talking about enemies that apply status effects to Mesa also being affected by those status effects, but I don't think that works. It might be referring to something else, but even after testing it, I still don't know what this tip is trying to say, which probably means that the tip kinda sucks. Protect Mesa from incoming fire and melee attacks by keeping Shatter Shield and Shooting Gallery active at the same time. 0. We already have a tip about Shooting Gallery dealing with melee enemies, so you're not really getting anything out of this tip. Refresh Shooting Gallery's gun jamming effect on enemies who have recovered from it by passing by them again while it is active. 0. Shooting Gallery stuns enemies within a base 16 meters for 1.5 seconds with a cooldown of 1.5 seconds, neither which scale with duration and neither are mentioned in the ability stats. This means that enemies have a brief window where they aren't stunned and can still attack you. Also, there is a visual indicator of a lasso hitting an enemy, which implies that it only affects that one target despite hitting everyone around Mesa. This tip just kinda lets you know that you can apply the stun again to the same enemy by getting close to them, which isn't helpful. Also, I'd argue that you're not refreshing the stun, you're applying it again, as refreshing usually means that you're reapplying an effect while it is still active, which isn't what's going on here. Anyway, this tip is just kind of pointless. Hold fire while Peacemaker is active to rapidly fire Mesa's regulators, targeting all enemies currently within her reticle. 0. This is just how Peacemaker works. Sure, it's explaining the core mechanics of the ability, but you literally can't use the ability without realizing this, and it's ridiculously obvious that to fire the guns, you press the shoot guns button. Sure, it also explains the reticle, but like, isn't that also really obvious? I also don't think this tip has any reason to exist. Cast Peacemaker in short burst while in the air or sliding along the ground to maintain damage without sacrificing mobility. +2. Movement tech, my beloved. I will say that sliding barely works and isn't worth trying to do, but jumping is great. You could arguably figure this out on your own with enough time, but I appreciate just pointing it out here so more people can do this as soon as they pick Mesa up. Continuous fire shrinks Peacemaker's focus ring, but increases its damage. Recast the ability to reset the ring and target more enemies or maintain fire to take down tougher targets. +2. Again, you could arguably figure this out on your own, but most players are not going to do that. This is a pretty core part of Peacemaker and using it, though most people would likely at least be able to intuit the shrinking ring, but knowing about the increased damage and recasting to reset is really useful. Cast Mesa's defensive abilities before entering Peacemaker to protect her while she's unable to move freely. +2. This seems pretty obvious, but it is very important to cast Shooting Gallery and Shatter Shield before Peacemaker because they can't be cast during it. Mesa's Waltz is an augment mod for Peacemaker, which allows Mesa to move, roll, and backflip while it's active. +1. Arguably useful as the augment itself only mentions being able to move, nothing about being able to roll, though you would probably figure that out pretty fast. If it was up to me, I would change the augment description to Mesa can walk at 50% speed and roll during Peacemaker. Specifically saying walk, as move implies that she can move normally at 50% speed, when she's actually unable to jump or slide. Extra. With the Mesa's Waltz equipped, the focus ring expands again after ceasing fire for a moment. Unlike most other Exalted weapons, Mesa doesn't even have a tip that mentions that her regulators are moddable, which is not great. Still, I think this should just be part of Peacemaker's description. Chroma. Chroma's effigy benefits from Vex Armor's Fury damage buff, +1. This is pretty good if you want to do damage with effigy. But why would you want to do that? Effigy is really bad. Also, do note that you need to be within Vex Armor's share range for effigy to get the damage buff, and the armor from Vex Armor also applies to effigy. Heat Elemental Ward heals allies within range by increasing their base health, -1. When an ally enters Heat Ward's range for the first time, they gain extra maximum health, which technically heals them for that amount. However, if that ally leaves the range and then re-enters it, they'll regain the maximum health, but not actually heal. It's weird, and I really think that healing is the wrong word to use here. It's only technically healing, and even then there's some jank. Also, all the other Elemental Ward offensive auras are explained by the tips, except for Heat Ward's aura. This is of course a reference to the fact that Heat Ward's offensive aura doesn't do anything. It's going to be an ongoing issue that Elemental Ward's description just doesn't even bother to explain the offensive auras, so they've all just been shoved here in the ability tips. Toxin Elemental Ward surrounds Chroma with toxic fumes that have a chance of inflicting toxin status effects on nearby enemies. It also grants nearby allies a reload speed and holster speed increase, +1. It's the bare minimum about how Toxin Ward works, without any of the important stuff, like it dealing % health damage or only being able to have one stack of Toxin at the same enemy, which results in the aura not activating on targets with an active Toxin status from any other source. It really doesn't help that the only thing in the ability stats is a status chance 50%, not mentioning the 5 meter range or the 5% maximum health damage. This tip says that there's a Toxin Cloud, but it's still not at all clear what the significance of it is and what you're supposed to do with it. Also, this tip forgets to mention that Toxin Ward gives increased weapon damage on weapon swap. Electric Elemental Ward increases allies' base shields and converts incoming damage into lightning arc discharges, +1. This explains what the aura does, reflecting damage as electric bolts. Thankfully, the ability stats do mention a damage multiplier and a range, so it's a little easier to figure out how this works exactly. Still, the effect is really bad and not worth playing around. Cold Elemental Ward increases allies' base armor and creates a shield that deflects damage back to enemies, +2. The same as the last one, this is really the only way to figure out how this ability works without doing intensive testing or looking it up. I know Cold Ward has some cool interactions that can make it a lot stronger, but this tip is just giving a basic description. Recast Vex Armor before its duration ends to maintain Chroma's Scorn and Fury buffs, +2. An incredibly important part of playing Chroma. Thinking that you have to stack up Vex Armor again every time the ability runs out sounds like a complete nightmare. While most people would likely figure this out pretty fast, this tip potentially saves someone from a massive headache, which makes it a pretty decent tip in my book. Vex Armor is triggered by damage to Chroma's shields and health or kills with melee abilities and ranged weapons. To optimize Vex Armor, equip mods that increase health and shields. -2. This is technically correct, but building for shields and health on Chroma is generally not a good idea, and he's much better off with a lot of other different mods. So this is not wrong, but it's just bad advice that you should not follow. Vex Armor Scorn buff scales with armor mods like Steel Fiber, while the Fury buff scales with base damage mods like Serration, -3. Scaling with means that something is increased by something else. That is not how Vex Armor interacts with armor or base damage mods. In fact, since Vex Armor provides so much armor and base damage, it becomes suboptimal to use these mods at all, so suggesting using them is misleading players into making worse builds. However, this tip could be fixed by just changing scales with to something along the lines of functions like. Vex Armor's Fury increases Spectral Scream's damage, +3. Spectral Scream is not an amazing ability by any means, but with some investment and effort, it is absolutely able to take you through Steel Path missions, almost exclusively because of this effect. It's basically opening a new niche playstyle for Chroma, even if that playstyle isn't optimal. I really think this should just be added to Spectral Scream's description. While effigy is active, Chroma receives a movement speed increase and armor reduction, -3. This has the same problem as effigy's ability stats. Armor reduction is a very specific term used by all abilities that reduce enemy armor. Having it here as a completely different mechanic that is detrimental is insane and really misleading. How do they expect someone to look at this or effigy's ability stats and not think, oh sick, an armor strip, that's really helpful, while the effect does basically the opposite? I really think it should be reworded to armor loss to clarify what it actually does, but effigy's description generally just needs an update, removing the part about strengthening nearby allies and replacing it with the fact that effigy duplicates credit drops. Extra. When Spectral Scream hits an enemy, it chains to another enemy, making it much more powerful against grouped up enemies. Being within 10 meters of effigy doubles all credit pickups for Chroma and allies, though this should be part of the ability description, especially when this is often the only reason people ever use effigy or even play Chroma. Effigy has a health bar and can be damaged by enemies. Stay close to protect it and grant it the armor from Vex Armor. If it dies, the ability ends early. Effigy can roar to stun all enemies within 30 meters or knock back enemies that get within 5 meters. You can have different elemental effects active on your Spectral Scream, Elemental Ward, and Effigy simultaneously. Equinox. Select bright emissive colors to default Equinox to her day form when entering missions, or dark emissive colors for her night form. +2. Your fashion having an actual impact on gameplay is a kinda weird concept, but also kinda cool. While this isn't a huge deal for base Equinox, as she can just cast Metamorphosis, this is a really good piece of advice for anyone looking to subsume over her first. It is worth noting that bright is a little misleading, as some brighter colors like bright red will still end up with night form. Metamorphosis to Equinox's day form to receive increased weapon damage and movement speed. 0. This is already explained in the ability description for Metamorphosis. Metamorphosis's buffs decay over time. Switch forms often to maximize their effects. +1. Metamorphosis already states that the buffs are temporary, but I can definitely imagine that most players would assume that the buff just lasts for the listed 25 seconds. This just explains that players should be even less excited about what is already not a particularly great buff. In Equinox's night form, Rest's sleeping effect makes it easier to pick off enemies while Mend is active, increasing its regenerating effect to allies. 0. Rest crowd controls enemies, making them easier to kill to then charge Mend is what I think this is trying to say. This tip could be significantly better if it mentioned that Rest opens enemies to finishers, also making them very easy to kill, but as it stands, this is a pretty nothing tip. Switch to Equinox's night form with Metamorphosis for a quick burst of shield replenishment. 0. Same as the second tip. This is already in the ability description. Cast Rage while Provoke is active to increase enemy damage vulnerability. 0. The ability strength from range affects her other abilities. Enemies closest to Equinox while Pacify is active receive higher damage reduction. -2. This is wrong. It's not that the damage reduction is higher against enemies that are closer, it's lower against enemies that are farther away. If you look at Pacify's base 50% damage reduction and assume that it's higher against closer enemies, like this tip implies, you would be wrong. I think the ability description should probably mention that the DR is less effective with range, since getting half the expected damage reduction because of falloff is really impactful. Metamorphosis to Equinox's night form, while Provoke is active to apply its bonus ability strength to the temporary armor and shields gained from switching forms. Why is there a comma? 0. I feel like this is not too hard to figure out, but the effect is also just really underwhelming and not really anything. Pacify and Provoke drains Equinox's energy only when enemies are within range. -2. Provoke does not drain energy based on enemies, it drains 5 energy for every Warframe ability cast within its range, so that part is blatantly wrong. Recast Maim and discharge all stored damage to break nearby containers and resource deposits. +2. This is a decent use case, but Equinox is far from the best box breaker at this point. Extra. Rest can be used during conservation instead of the tranq rifle. Enemies affected by Rest are open to melee finishers. Rage increases both enemy movement and attack speed. Maim is based on the max health and shields of enemies that die in the radius. Killing a particularly tough enemy lets Maim easily kill any remaining weaker enemies. It's a little more complicated than that, but it's true enough to be a good tip. Mend and Maim's stored damage is not affected by strength. Maim's explosion has falloff, dealing less damage to enemies that are farther away. Activate it while close to enemies to get the most out of it. The Augment mod energy transfer lets Equinox stay in night form for its survivability while still being able to charge up and unleash Maim. If DE won't make energy transfer baseline, there could at least be a tip about how it lets Equinox live out her thematic fantasy. Atlas. Atlas is immune to damage during landslide attacks. +3. Landslide is a fairly long animation that you'll be stuck in quite a lot when playing Atlas, so knowing that it makes you completely invulnerable is a pretty big deal. As long as you have energy to cast Landslide, you can stay permanently immune to damage, letting Atlas skip out on a lot of survivability, which I think Atlas players deserve to know. Land successful Landslide punches back to back to deal more damage to the next enemy and send them flying on every third punch in the chain. -2. The increased damage is due to the combo. If you're a 12 times combo, each of the 3 consecutive punches will deal the same amount of damage. Petrified enemies drop rubble when killed that restore Atlas's health on pickup or increase his armor if health is full. +3. Rubble is a core mechanic to Atlas's kit, and kind of his passive in a sense. Both Petrify and Rumblers mention them dropping healing rubble, but don't explain the armor part, so this tip ends up being required knowledge for understanding how Atlas works. I think it would make a lot of sense for this to be explained in Atlas's passive. Landslide's damage scales based on mods equipped on it, as well as the ability combo counter, +2. Landslide scaling with equipped mods is already in its ability description, but the part about the combo is really useful information, but I think it should be fairly intuitive. Petrified enemies killed by landslide drop rubble that restore more health and armor than regular drops, +2. If rubble was explained better, I think that this would just be a good extra tip to highlight synergy between Atlas's abilities. Also, in case you're wondering, this better rubble gives 75 health or armor, which is 50% higher than the usual 50. Bulwarks summoned by tectonics can be used to block doors, pathways, and even protect objectives, -2. True, but you probably shouldn't be doing this. The best case scenario is that the enemies break through it in seconds, while the worst case scenario is that it messes with their AI and makes them just kind of run around for no reason, which is especially problematic in defense missions where you want to kill enemies as fast as possible. So this is not wrong, but just really bad advice. Aiming Petrify at Atlas's Rumblers instantly heals them back to max health, +1. This is cool, but it runs into the problem that the Rumblers just aren't very good, or worth playing around. If you want to get the most out of the Rumblers, this is very useful, but the vast majority of Atlas players are likely not doing that. Aiming Petrify at Atlas's Bulwarks increases their rolling speed, distance, and damage, 0. This is an interesting synergy on paper, but Tectonic's damage just sucks, and increasing it with Petrify doesn't really make any difference. Doing this outside of very low level missions is just a waste of time and energy. Recast Rumblers to detonate Atlas's Brawlers, dealing blast damage to nearby enemies and create rubble, +2. The damage is 1250 over 6 meters with falloff, so it's not really worth anything. However, each Rumbler drops 1 piece of rubble each, restoring 50 health or armor, or less if the Rumblers took any damage before destroying them. This is barely any rubble. Atlas would have to do this 15 times to fully stack his rubble, though that is potentially possible in some situations, and outside of that, this can be a good way to keep rubble from decaying, so it's a good thing to keep in mind. Rumbler's Brawler's durability is influenced by Atlas's health, shield, armor, and ability strength, +3. Even if the Rumblers suck, players should at least know how to make the most out of it. Them scaling with Atlas's own stats is really cool and helps you build around them in an interesting way. It is worth noting that since the Rumblers don't have any shields, any shield mods will just increase their health. The Rumbler's size also scales with power strength, allowing them to get very big with high strength, but also very small with negative strength. Extra. The Bulwark from Tectonics absorbs incoming damage for a few seconds after being cast, adding the stored damage to its health. Its health is also increased by 500% of Atlas's armor. Enemies will prioritize hitting the Tectonics Bulwark if no players are close. It has the same threat level as players, basically. Landslide's Augment Rubble Heap also doubles Landslide's dash range from 10 to 20 meters when above 1400 armor from rubble. The augment only mentions faster, not farther. It should probably be updated. Enemies must be petrified to take increased damage. Crowd control immune enemies like bosses or those with Overguard won't be affected by Petrify's damage vulnerability. Wukong. Change the focus of Wukong's Celestial Twin by recasting the ability on an enemy. Doing so increases the damage dealt by the twin and can be especially useful when dealing with higher priority targets. 0. Already explained in the ability description. The only thing added is that you should use this on priority targets, which is pretty obvious. Hold Celestial Twin to dismiss the existing twin. +3. Should probably just be part of the main description for when you don't want the clone to mindlessly attack everything and ruin your stealthy gameplay. Also, the animation for doing this is pretty damn funny. Cast Cloudwalker to bypass security cameras and traverse through laser barriers. +2. For a lot of people, this ends up being one of the best use cases for Cloudwalker, and it's why Wukong is often considered the best spy frame. Cloudwalker heals Wukong based on distance traveled in cloud form. Escape and reposition during tough combat encounters, re-emerging ready to fight. +2. Cloudwalker doesn't heal at all unless you move around, which isn't explained in the ability description, but I feel like most players won't cast Cloudwalker just to stand completely still, so it probably doesn't have to be in the base description. Still, this is a very good explanation of how exactly the healing works, so it works pretty well as a tip. Cloudwalker's heal and invulnerability also apply to Celestial Twin if active. 0. The ability description already says that it heals both Wukong and his twin, though it technically doesn't mention the invulnerability, but I still just think this is explained well enough by the ability description. Celestial Twin remains active during Cloudwalker and teleports to Wukong once deactivated. +1. This is kind of the same as the last one. I think the ability description already explains this decently well, though the part about the twin teleporting to Wukong at the end is kinda useful, though only just barely. Defy is cast in sync with Wukong's Celestial Twin. Damage absorbed by both is combined into a single value, affecting the strength of their retaliatory strike as well as their shared armor bonus. +2. This is pretty cool, though especially in high level missions, the armor cap is not very hard to reach even without this. It's more cool than practical, but to be fair, it is pretty cool. Primal Fury's Iron Staff can be separately modded in the arsenal. +3. This is the same as any other Exalted weapon. This is a core part of what makes an Exalted weapon good, so it should be in the base ability description. I'm just going to combine the next 4 tips since they're all about Primal Fury's stance. Melee with Primal Fury active to perform frontal attacks with high damage multipliers. Melee while moving forward with Primal Fury to perform fast sweeping attacks. Melee while holding aim with Primal Fury active to perform area of effect attacks that stagger enemies. Melee while holding aim and moving forward to perform high range and gap closing attacks. +2. The stance is actually really cool, and I think it's completely justified to highlight it. Neutral attacks it multiple times, which definitely lives up to the idea of high damage multipliers. Also, Wukong drops the staff and scrambles to pick it up, which is really funny. The forward attacks are indeed fast sweeping attacks that are better at hitting multiple enemies. It's also worth noting that the last hit creates a vortex that pulls in enemies. The neutral block combo is a series of slams that staggers enemies and also has some really fun animations. The forward block combo is a very high range poke, around 18 meters at base, followed by a dash. Melee combat often just devolves into holding down the melee button, so bringing up how you can use different parts of the stance to do different things is really cool. I really like this tip. Wukong's passive has 5 possible survival techniques. Primal Forces, triple elemental damage for 60 seconds. Heavenly Cloak, invisibility for 30 seconds. Cosmic Armor, invulnerability for 30 seconds. Monkey Luck, extra loot drops for 60 seconds. Sly Alchemy, orbs 4 times more effective for 60 seconds. +3. You have absolutely no way of figuring out what Wukong's passive does without reading this tip, or I guess repeatedly dying, checking what happens, and then writing it down to keep track of all the different effects. This might be the most +3 tip so far. Extra. Wukong's twin switches to the equipped melee weapon when Wukong equips his primary or secondary. When Wukong swaps to his melee, the clone equips either the primary or secondary based on which one Wukong was holding before swapping. Unequipping your melee weapon allows Wukong and his twin to use ranged weapons at the same time. Unequipping both your primary and secondary allows both of you to use melee weapons at the same time. The twin's weapons use your ammo pool and the twin will pick up ammo off the ground. If the twin runs out of ammo, a red indicator appears above its head, and it will equip your secondary or melee weapon until it can find an ammo pickup. Avoid equipping the twin with explosive weapons as it might end up staggering itself. End Cloudwalker in the air to maintain the momentum. Recast or perform a melee attack to end Cloudwalker early. Passing through enemies during Cloudwalker leaves them open to finishers. Enemies are more likely to focus Wukong and his twin while casting Defy. The twin will mimic any emote Wukong himself performs, which lets him do a handshake with himself. I know this isn't practical, but it's really fun. Casting Cloudwalker or Defy cleanses Wukong, but not the twin, of any harmful status effects. Activating Primal Fury also makes the Celestial Twin equip Iron Staff, though this should probably be in an actual ability description as it has a ton of gameplay implications. Wukong's Exalted Iron Staff gets more melee range with combo level, up to an extra 5.5 meters at max combo. Iron Staff also visually grows longer with increased melee range. Though this is such a powerful and cool effect that it probably belongs in the actual ability description or as a unique trait in Iron Staff's modding screen. Also, it's worth noting that the twin cannot build combo, so it doesn't benefit from this effect or mods like Blood Rush. Ivara. Stack Ivara's radar passive with mods like Enemy Radar. 0. This is true, but I don't think this is really useful. Honestly, I would argue that it works the other way around. Since Ivara already gets radar from a passive, she doesn't need mods like Enemy Radar. When using certain navigator setups, like with the Fluctus, having very high enemy radar can be useful, but outside of that, whatever. Use Alt Fire with Artemis Bow to instantly shoot the currently selected Quiver arrow. +2. This is a pretty cool mechanic, and it makes Quiver not have a cast time at all. This makes spamming sleep arrows to put enemies to sleep, or hitting allies with cloak arrows a lot easier. It can arguably be detrimental to use this though, as using the Alt Fire will consume Longbow Sharpshot, which I think is by far the best arcane for Artemis Bow, so in that case you're probably better off just casting the ability the normal way. Fire a cloak arrow from Ivara's quiver onto allies to temporarily grant them invisibility. +1. I think what this is trying to say is that the cloak arrow will stick to allies if you shoot them directly, which is actually really cool and a great use case, but I just don't think this tip really gets that across. I think this should say something like, cloak arrows from Ivara's quiver can stick to allies to grant them invisibility as they move around. Ivara can create multiple ziplines using dash wire arrow from quiver, +1. This is useful, but not too hard to figure out. This should definitely say that you can create 4 and not just multiple. Increase the alert radius of noise arrow from Ivara's quiver with ability range mods, 0. Good old visibility scales with mods type tip. This is just useless. Navigator can be used with quiver's arrows to direct the chosen arrow, 0. This is true and thematically fun, but sadly there's basically not any situations where this is something you should be doing. Increase the projectile speed of Navigator by holding fire or holding aim to decrease, +2. A pretty big part of using and getting the most out of Navigator. It's not too hard to figure out, but it's still good to have it explained somewhere. This could arguably be in the main description, but I think it works fine as a tip. A single arrow shot from Ivara's Artemis bow can be controlled using Navigator, -2. I find this tip kind of funny. It's just pointing out the blatant anti-synergy between Navigator and Artemis bow. Navigator can be really good with weapons that fire a single powerful projectile, but Artemis bow isn't that. It's a shotgun bow that fires a ton of smaller, weaker arrows. Just don't use Navigator and Artemis bow together, it sucks. Roll while Prowl is active to cover more ground without breaking Ivara's cloaked state, +3. The ability description for Prowl actually doesn't mention that it limits Ivara's mobility. This should be explained somehow in the ability description, though I guess this could still stay as a tip. Avoid the energy drain and movement restrictions from Prowl by traveling on ziplines, -2. You are able to sprint while on dash wire, but bullet jumping still cancels the ability, so the restrictions are only partially lifted. However, the energy drain is the exact same, so that part of the tip is just blatantly wrong. Being on a zipline during Prowl is still a good idea, as it lets you move around a lot faster, but this tip just comes in with so much misinformation that it doesn't make up for it. Alarming weapons temporarily drop Prowl's invisibility when fired. Silent weapons allows invisibility to be maintained, +3. This mechanic will screw you over repeatedly without it really being clear what is happening, as a majority of the weapons in the game are loud, and this isn't anywhere in the ability description. It should just be added to avoid confusion. This tip could at least mention that any primary and secondary weapon can be modded to be silent. Navigator can apply to a projectile that is already in flight. If no projectiles are active, it will apply to the next one that is fired, +2. This is just good quality of life knowledge for using Navigator. Extra. You can have up to 3 cloak arrow bubbles active at the same time. Noise arrow does not alert enemies, it just makes them move towards it. This also means that it only works on unalerted enemies. Enemies affected by sleep arrow are open to melee finishers. Sleep arrow's sleep cannot be refreshed by casting the ability again. Enemies have to wake up before they can be put to sleep again. Ivara is invisible while controlling Navigator, even without Prowl active. Weapons with punch through lets Navigator hit more enemies with a single cast. The Navigator projectile gains more damage over time. This damage increase grows faster with a lower duration, however that also increases the energy drain. Prowl can pickpocket enemies faster with duration mods. Prowl's drain increases when Ivara moves, and uses energy for every enemy hit by melee attacks, and every time she takes damage. Artemis Bow's Uncharged Shot is better for single targets, while the Charged Shot is better for hitting multiple enemies at once. Sleep Arrow can be used during conservation instead of the Tranq Rifle. Artemis Bow is also missing a tip that points out that it's moddable. I still think it should be part of the main description, but it could at least have a tip, you know? Also, Artemis Bow's description should be updated to say that it drains 15 energy per shot. Nezha. Use Firewalker to lock down strategic areas such as narrow pathways or objectives, -1. Firewalker's trail does briefly stun enemies because of its heat status, but I don't think that's enough to actually lock down an area. If you try to use this in an interception or something similar, you'll be pretty disappointed. Firewalker removes status effects from allies when they cross its path, +2. A really cool part of the ability that gives Nezha a lot of cool supportive potential that you can absolutely choose to play around, spreading out your fire trail to help out allies. Still, it's fairly hard to actually play around, especially in public lobbies where coordination isn't something you should expect, and Nezha himself already gained status immunity from warding Halo. Recast Blazing Chakram to teleport Nezha to the Chakram. If Firewalker is active, a ring of fire will also appear wherever he lands. 0. The recasting to teleport is already in Blazing Chakram's description. And the Ring of Fire is technically in Firewalker's description, even though it just says teleporting without clarification about what kind of teleporting. Still, the effect is so minor that I don't think there needs to be a whole ability tip to explain it. Maybe this tip could mention that it resets your air jump, though that still wouldn't make for a great tip. Cast Blazing Chakram on enemies impaled by Divine Spears to spawn a second Chakram, +2. A really cool synergy that lets Nezha deal a decent-ish amount of damage with his Chakram. Obviously this doesn't scale super well without a lot of investment, but it's still cool and might inspire some funky builds, so I like this tip. This could definitely be explained better though, as it's not just one extra Chakram, it can spawn an extra for every impaled enemy. I'd probably change it to something like, cast Blazing Chakram on an enemy impaled by Divine Spears to create another Chakram every time it hits a new impaled enemy. Charge Nezha's Blazing Chakram before launching it to increase its damage and cause it to fly straight ahead instead of locking onto enemies, +3. The base description does mention charging Blazing Chakram, but does not mention that it makes it not lock onto enemies, so this is a decent tip. It definitely makes Blazing Chakram a lot more useful in cramped corridors or against grouped enemies, since it usually only hits up to 6 enemies. Also, it more than doubles its range from 30 meters to 75. This means that charging makes the teleport a lot better. After Warding Halo's health depletes, a wave of heat damage ignites surrounding enemies, and a brief invulnerability phase gives Nezha time to recast his Halo safely, +2. The heat damage is a 10 meter radius that does 100 heat damage with falloff, so not really anything worth keeping in mind. It does have a guaranteed heat status that can briefly stun enemies, but you already have Firewalker for that. However, the brief invulnerability is a huge deal, saving Nezha in a lot of higher level content where he is at risk of being killed without Warding Halo up. Warding Halo prevents status effects such as slash and knockdowns, +3. This should absolutely be added to the main description. Status immunity is a big part of why the ability is so good. Safeguard is an augment mod for Warding Halo that allows Nezha to cast halos onto allies, 0. Just an augment, yet it does a worse job explaining how Warding Halo works, as it forgets to mention that the halos on allies are only 50% effective. In that the health of the halos are halved, they still offer 90% damage reduction. Cast Warding Halo when under heavy fire to briefly prevent damage and increase the durability of the resulting halo, +3. Warding Halo absorbing incoming damage is what allows it to scale into higher level content, and is kind of the main reason it's as good as it is. This needs to be in the ability description. Recast Divine Spears while the ability is active to retract the spears, dealing additional damage to impaled enemies, 0. This is already explained in the ability description. Extra. With Nezha's passive, he can quickly tap slide to get a burst of momentum. Not a tip, but Firewalker's description really should say that it gives movement speed. That's one of the main selling points of the ability. Also, the fact that the speed doesn't scale with strength sucks. Blazing Chakram is shown on the map as an orange circle, making it easier to plan when to recast the teleport to it for maximum distance. Heavy attacking with a melee weapon causes Blazing Chakram to return early, or explode if it's already on the way back. Though I suspect that this is probably an unintended side effect of the devs reusing the code from melee glaives or something like that. Warding Halo only blocks up to 90% of incoming damage, which means that Nezha still needs some extra survivability outside of Warding Halo. Though I'm honestly kinda shocked that this isn't in the ability stats, as it otherwise just reads as if it works just like Iron Skin. Which, I mean, to be fair, is how it used to work, but still. Warding Halo's bonus health is increased by Nezha's armor. You can technically see this as the damage absorption goes up with armor, though I think this would also fit in the actual description as it has a lot of implications for how you should build Nezha. Inaros. The more Inaros dies, the more hits on enemies are required to revive him. Staying alive will reduce that number over time, +2. A really good warning/disclaimer about his passive, warning you not to rely on it too much, though I feel like most people will intuitively avoid dying, because, you know. Either way, I don't think this mechanic is exactly intuitive, so it's good to have it explained here. When downed, find an enemy that can survive multiple hits to revive Inaros quickly, 0. Honestly, from my testing, the damage Inaros does when trying to revive is so low that you don't really have to worry about enemies dying. What this tip probably should mention is that you should focus on hitting multiple enemies at once to revive faster. Attacks from Inaros' Swarm Cavats contribute to his revival progress, +2. A really useful tip that gives a great reason to focus on having the Swarm Cavats active at all times, and just points out a really cool synergy that isn't super obvious at first. I really like this tip. Cast Desiccation while enemies are facing Inaros to blind them, then use a melee finisher to gain health, +3. Enemies do not have to be facing Inaros to be blinded, though I doubt anyone is waiting for enemies to be facing them to cast this ability. Still, it probably shouldn't say that. The part about melee finishers is technically also wrong, as this isn't a part of desiccation, but actually applies to any finisher kill, though this is still good advice for how you should be using desiccation, so it gets a pass. The finisher healing isn't really mentioned anywhere else, and it really should be in his passive description. Also, yes, technically, this just says melee finisher to gain health, when you actually have to kill the enemy to gain the health. Sandstorm is a great way to get out of desperate situations, healing Inaros and making him invincible while active, +3. Sandstorm making Inaros completely invulnerable is a huge part of why you want to use the ability, and that really should be in the ability description. Sandstorm can be ended early by casting it a second time, +1. I think this is fairly obvious, and most other similar abilities also work this way, but it's still good to know. It's also worth noting that melee attacking also ends the ability early. Each status effect absorbed by Scarab Shield drains 5% of the charge armor. Rebuild this protection by recasting the ability. 0. This is already explained in the ability description. All this is really adding is that you can rebuild by recasting the ability, which is pretty obvious. What this tip should mention is that every time the Scarab Shield blocks a status effect, it makes Inaros completely status immune for 3 seconds. Regain health consumed by Scarab Shield by casting Sandstorm in a large group of enemies, or using finishers enabled by desiccation, +1. These are pretty obvious kit synergies, but it's fine to make it absolutely clear since it's kind of Inaros' core gameplay loop, in a sense. Extra. Enemies grouped by Sandstorm are open to ground finishers after the ability ends, letting Inaros heal for even more. Inaros is not able to fully charge Scarab Swarm without outside healing, or increases to his base health like mods. Sand can scale with the level of the enemy they were created from. Not a tip, but the passive description really needs to mention that any finisher kills heal Inaros for 20% of his maximum health. Please. It's only ever mentioned in a couple ability tips, and it isn't even in Desiccation's description. Titania. Refresh Spellbind status effect immunity by recasting it on Titania or allies. 0. Applying the effect again refreshes its duration. That's very obvious. Allies' companions within range of Tribute's Full Moon buff also benefit from its damage increase, +2. It should also mention that the Razorflies from Razorwing also get the damage buffs, but it should probably also say that all the Tribute buffs apply to all allies within the 35-meter range. Allies within range of Tribute's Thorn buff also benefit from its damage reduction and reflection, +3. The fact that Thorns reflects damage isn't actually mentioned anywhere else, which is weird because that's clearly supposed to be the main feature. It's called Thorns, after all. Outside of that, the fact that allies also benefit from Thorns isn't explained in the base description, which it probably should be. Enemies that survive any of Titania's Tribute buffs have their attacks weakened, +1. It turns out that Tribute targets actually deal 25% less damage after being affected by Tribute, not affected by Strength. I could see an argument for putting it in Tribute's description, but it's such a minor effect that definitely isn't worth playing around, so I don't think it should be there. Titania gains 1 additional Razorfly for each Tribute buff active, +3, a really cool mechanic that should be in Razorwing's description, and these are actually permanent while in Razorwing, and don't disappear if the Tribute buffs run out. Refresh the duration of Titania's active Tribute by casting and collecting the same aura from an enemy, 0. This feels a little misleading. Active Tribute singular seems to imply that you can only have 1, otherwise it's just saying that refreshing the buff refreshes the buff. Lantern can be cast on multiple enemies, and affected enemies can be detonated by charging the ability, +3. It's otherwise not clear that you can have multiple lanterns at the same time. It really should mention that you can have a max of 4 targets. Enemies attacked by Razorwing's Razorflies have increased vulnerability to damage from your attacks, 0. This is already mentioned in the main description, though arguably this is kinda misleading as this only specifies Titania's own attacks, while the main description says that the enemies just take more damage from anything. Basically, there is absolutely no reason for this tip to exist. Titania's Razorwing weapons, the Dex Pixia pistols and the Dewata blade, can be modded separately in the arsenal, +3, same as all other exalted weapons. Titania can cast her other abilities while in Razorwing, +1, obvious but good to know, I guess. Titania's small size while in Razorwing combined with Tribute's Dust buff greatly increases her evasive chances, +2. Razorwing's 50% evasion combined with Dust's 50% inaccuracy adds up to a 75% chance to not get hit. You absolutely can and should combine these 2 buffs. Cast Razor Wing while in the air to shorten the cast time, +1. Not super obvious, but also not super impactful, just a nice quality of life thing. Extra. Enemies are very likely to target the Razor Flies, making them even less likely to hit Titania herself. None of the tribute buffs are affected by strength mods. Why is this a thing? Unlike other slows like Cold, Entangle only slows enemy movement speed and not their action speed. Titania's bullet jumps and rolls are 25% longer. Spellbind status immunity also prevents the brief stun from bumping into terrain during Razor Wing. Razor Flies will seek out and pick up the tribute offerings. Titania cannot interact with consoles or pick up things like energy cells while in Razor Wing. Actually, fun fact, if you equip the tranq rifle, you can suddenly interact with consoles again, which is probably not intentional, but it's very useful. Companions disappear while Razor Wing is active. Nidus. Hold Virulence to highlight the area it will travel before casting, +1. It's neat and can help you visualize how Virulence works, but you'll very often just be spamming this ability, and since the ability refunds energy, there's not much of a reason to be super precise with it. Cast Larva close to the ground so that Virulence can reach enemies caught by the tendrils for easy mutation stacks, +2. Fairly easy to figure out and intuitive, but it's incredibly important to playing Nidus, so it's important to understand and keep this in mind. Link to an ally or enemy with Parasitic Link and cast Virulence to create a second growth from the linked unit, +3. This is really cool and also really useful, letting you get twice the value out of Virulence, meaning more damage, mutation stacks, and energy. This is definitely a lot more useful when linked to an enemy or companion since they're a lot easier to keep track of than allied players. It's worth noting that the Virulence indicator also appears at your Parasitic Pal's location, letting you aim their cast as well. This should definitely be mentioned in the ability description. Use Parasitic Link on free-moving companions and specters to buff Nidus and the companion or specter, +3. This is incredibly useful, letting Nidus get the strength buff in solo missions, or just consistently keep it in multiplayer missions. I get that you could infer that Ally also extends companions, but the fact that it only works on free-moving companions makes that a little more complicated. And the fact that the ability description focuses so much on the ability strength also puts a lot of focus on using it on other Warframes. Ravenous uses mutation stacks instead of energy to cast. The ability icon lights up when there are enough stacks to cast. +1. It's a little confusing to suddenly have an ability that doesn't cost energy, but instead mutation stacks, especially now that Parasitic Link doesn't use mutation. This is mentioned in the ability stats, but I doubt everyone is going to spot that at first, so you avoid a bit of confusion by having it explained here. Enemy heavy units can withstand more damage, which makes them ideal Parasitic Link targets, +1. Okay, I might be alone, but this tip confused me for a while. Basically, the linked enemy is immune to all damage except the damage that Nidus redirects to it. I feel like this tip could have been explained a little better. This is something that you often have to keep in mind when using the ability. I just don't like how it's explained though. Cast Virulence into Ravenous' infested area to detonate maggots and deal blast damage to nearby enemies, -1. Not only is this already explained by Ravenous' ability description, this tip feels like it explains it worse. It's not casting Virulence into Ravenous that detonates the maggots, it's hitting the maggots themselves with Virulence that makes them pop. While Ravenous is active, hold Virulence to mark the location of its maggots and release to cast, +2. A really cool mechanic that I had no idea even existed. This makes the whole Virulence maggot explosion way easier to set up, as the maggots can be basically impossible to actually spot in a chaotic mission. No idea why the maggot icon is pixel art though, that's kinda weird. Standing in Ravenous' area regenerates health over time and scales with ability strength mods, +3. While this is mentioned in the ability stats, the description really should make this clear, since the healing is one of the most important parts of this ability. I don't think the ability description does a great job in general, it only talks about the maggots and not the big zone that it creates, which is really confusing. The more mutation stacks Nidus have, the more damage Virulence and detonated maggots deal, 0. Virulence states that mutation stacks multiply its destructive force, with damage per mutation stack listed in the ability stats. Ravenous mentions that the maggots benefit from mutation, with the stats mentioning rupture damage per mutation stack as well. For each enemy hit by the first pulse of damage, Virulence refunds a portion of its casting cost. This means lower ability efficiency can actually return more energy overall when striking groups larger than 4, +2. I think this tip could be improved by just saying that the energy refund is always 1/4 of the cost, regardless of efficiency. Still, this does a really good job of giving a more in-depth explanation of how the energy refund works, and explaining that only the initial hit gives energy. Parasitic Link will flash and play a sound when it's about to break to let you know you're too far away from your target. Plus 2. You might not notice this in chaotic missions or realize what it means if you do. This gives you something specific to look out for, which definitely helps you play around Parasitic Link a lot easier. Extra. Maggots continuously stagger enemies they latch onto. Nidus can have up to 200 mutation stacks at once. Though his passive should probably just say that, it should probably just explain what mutation even is in the first place. Being inside a Corpus Nullifier bubble constantly drains 1 mutation stack per second. Nidus gets special upgrades as he levels up, including a up to 15 health per second regeneration and 15% power strength at level 30. Virulence can only have 1 active field at a time. Not a tip, but Parasitic Link seems to list both the weapon damage buff and the strength buff as damage increase in his ability stats, which is pretty confusing as strength is not strictly a damage buff. I think these two should be split into damage increase and strength multiplier. Parasitic Link's increase to ability strength is multiplicative to any other source of strength, making it significantly more effective on allies that already have high strength. Parasitic Link grants Nidus and linked allies status immunity while active, though I really think this should be in the main description. Most enemies become immune to any incoming damage other than the redirected damage from Nidus and are stunned when affected by Parasitic Link. However, crowd control immune enemies like bosses or overguarded enemies are still vulnerable, even after the overguard is removed. The maggots from Ravenous also explode if killed by enemies. Not really a tip, but Ravenous really should mention that you can only have up to 9 maggots at the same time. Right, so as you might have noticed, this video stops here, only covering 11 out of the 22 frames that it was supposed to. The truth is that the video just ended up being way too long. It was a drag to work on and would probably also have ended up being kind of annoying to watch, so I decided to just split it into 2 separate videos. I am like 70% done with the second half, that being Octavia to Grendel, so it shouldn't take that long to finish. And lastly, special thanks to all the awesome people that helped me make this video. Mirrors, Sci-Fi Freak, Cows Are Everywhere, Julio, Death Crown, Ruby Blossom, Caboose for Life, K-Fedit, Smooth Turtle, Someone in Particular, Oolong, Cephalon Flare, Oni Skulls, Kalinas, and Kano Lathra.